this particular gospel story that we hear in John's gospel today, ostensibly, is the story about a wedding. But I think the wedding is really not the focus of it. It's not the point of the story. It's merely the setting, the scene, as it were. There's lots here, great symbolism in John's gospel that we need to unpack. Because as we situate this particular portion of Scripture in the Gospel of John, it's right at the very beginning. In fact, if you look at the title, it's the second chapter. Now, we heard from the first chapter right on Christmas Day, when John begins his rather philosophical ruminations about the incarnation, the coming of Jesus as one of us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and nothing came to be except through the Word, etc., etc., etc. It just kind of goes on and starts to rumble around, and pretty soon we're all lost in all of the words. But the most important part of that portion of the gospel is that portion where he says, and we're so familiar with, and he became flesh and dwelt among us. And I think we need to just hear that for a moment to understand that then what John launches into is part of what we're hearing today, and that's a very human set of stories. And there's nothing more human than a wedding. It's how people get coupled, it's how babies are made, there's all kinds of things that go on with this. So we go from this rather esoteric, theological, theoretical rumination down to the very nitty-gritty of everyday human life. But there's some wonderful symbolism in this story, as I mentioned, that I'd like us to think about, because it gives us pause after this rather noble and theological statement. We get into this everydayness of life. It begins on the third day, in part because just the end of that first chapter is the call of the disciples, and we hear that happen over a couple of days, and this is the third day. That's why Jesus has some disciples. He's not got a lot of them at that point. He just called a few to be with him, and they have answered the call. Nathaniel, Peter, Andrew. Well, Peter wasn't Peter, then he was still Simon, but there it is. There's just a few around him, and they've all been invited to this wedding. Now, there's nothing more human, I can say this from personal experience, than an ethnic mother. My mom, good Polish girl that she was, had this thing about food. And so when you had a wedding, you had to make sure everything was just so, and there had to be a lot of it. In fact, in Polish cultures, the weddings go on for a long time. There's the getting ready for the wedding, but then there's the wedding, and it's not like everybody goes home after that. The bride and groom leave, and then the party goes way into the night, and then there's so much left over that you come back the next day to the family home and continue to eat. There's even a word for it in Polish, but I won't go into all of that, but that it's just the custom to do. And so weddings at the time of Jesus were very similar to that. Whole villages would come to celebrate, and that sounds like a lot of people, but we have to realize the villages there were very small. But still, everybody. My ordination was sort of that way. I, again, came from an ethnic background, and we had this tiny little church that was pretty much, Polish-American people, third, fourth generation. My parents went through the guest list for the banquet we were going to have afterwards and realized we got to invite the whole parish because we're related to most of them anyway. And so there were 300 people at this banquet. And also about 150 of them came to the house the next day to continue eating and drinking and doing all the other things that you do when you celebrate. So it's a moment of great joy, these kinds of events in life, these human events that we have. And we celebrate them because they are milestone markers in our lives, particularly weddings, because people are starting a whole new life together and a whole new chapter of things. And so they're all celebrating. And maybe the village was a little bigger than they anticipated, or the people drank a little bit more than they anticipated. And of course, Jesus brought all of his friends along. Maybe the father of the bride was not really thinking about that too much. And suddenly they run out of wine. So the good ethnic mother that Mary of Galilee might have been says to Jesus, her son, they have no wine. And in typical ethnic mom style, she expects him to do something about it. And in typical eldest son style, he turns to her and says, what do you want me to do about it? And typically Mary says to the servants, fill the jars, or she didn't say that, do whatever he tells you to do, is what she said. So in other words, no matter what Jesus said or wanted to do, mom was in charge. Many of us can relate to that. Very human, very down to earth, very everyday. And there it is. Well, that's one piece of the story. But then we get into something else. We have those 6 water jars. Why is John so specific about this? He goes, there were 6 jars there, each 20 to 30 gallons. So in other words, there was going to be a lot. And John tells us that they filled the water to the brim. They didn't just fill the jars up to the neck of the jar. You could conveniently carry it. No, to the brim, which means if you move the jar at all, it's all going to spill out. I think what John is trying to get across to us was something about the abundance of what God was about to do. At the beginning of his gospel, he's telling us a story about tremendous abundance, that the containers could barely, they were filled and they could barely contain what was in them. And then Jesus does whatever Jesus did, and suddenly he tells the servants to take the wine to the steward. The steward takes the wine and, this is really good stuff. It's not just abundant, it's of the highest quality. So much so that the steward goes to the bridegroom and says, boy, you do things backwards around here, don't you? Usually we give them the good wine first, then they get drunk and they don't care what the rest of the wine tastes like, they just want more. Oh, but you did it differently. And so John is emphasizing that this wine is not only super abundant, there's more than enough to go around, it's also of the highest quality. And there it is, God's grace, God's life for us, super abundant, filled to the brim for our lives, and of the highest quality. We hear this later in John's gospel when Jesus says, I come that they might have life and might have it abundantly. So that theme runs all through John's gospel. Symbolically here, but Jesus actually says it later. That's not the end of it. There are 6 water jars. Why 6? Well, when we look at numbers in the Scripture, there are a few numbers that are commonly used. One of the most important numbers is 7. 7 days in which the world was created and God rested on the 7th day. It's the way we count days in the week. It's often seen by people who do number things as a perfect number. And it all through the Scripture, it's actually used that way. It's the completion of creation. 7 is one of those numbers that just sticks in our human experience. But why only 6? What happened to the 7th jar? Well, there is a 7th jar, but it's not at the wedding feast. We hear about the 7th jar much later. We see the 7th jar almost at the end of the gospel. We see the 7th jar at the foot of the cross on Mount Calvary. But there, it is not filled with the finest wine. It is sour wine. It is wine that is turned. In some texts, they say they offered Jesus to drink not sour wine, but vinegar. But the seventh jar was filled with bad wine. 7 jars. Have 6 jars filled with great joy and celebration, and the seventh, the foot of the cross and the sadness of that moment, tells us that our life isn't always going to be happy. That our life will sometimes have sour wine in it. We'll have suffering. But sometimes, even with God's life, we experience things in ways we don't want to experience. Jesus, hanging there on the cross, reminds us that suffering and death is part of our human experience. But, you see, we know that that's not the end of the story. And that's another thing about the numbers in Scripture. There's another number that also is important to us, and that's the number 8. It's the next day. It's what completes what has already happened. We do that in church all the time. You've heard me talk about it once in a while, that we have 8 days of preparation and 8 days of celebration. We just did Christmas. When did the church's vision turn from the themes of early Advent to the Incarnation? On the 17th day of December, 8 days before the 25th. We celebrate a great feast day on January 1. Yes, it's New Year's Day. I realize that, but that's not what we're celebrating. It's the Feast of the Holy Name in our liturgy, but it is the 8th day of Christmas. It's the octave day of Christmas. At Easter time, we celebrate 8 days before. What is the 8th day before Easter? It's Palm Sunday, Passion Sunday. Then we celebrate Easter week, and we get to Low Sunday, 8 days after Easter. It's on the 8th day that we celebrate the completion of something in its totality. And so that 7th jar at the foot of the cross is not the end. We look for the next day. And that day is the day of triumph. It is Easter Sunday, when it all comes round again. And we begin to realize that the transformation that Jesus begins by turning water into wine is actually about our lives. That the grace of God, superabundant as it is, the quality, the high quality that it is in terms of our life, even in spite of suffering and death, that it transforms us. And that's what St. Paul is talking about in today's letter to the Corinthians. He's talking about all of the things that the Spirit gives us to transform our lives. And for us to use to not transform ourselves only, but the world in which we live. That's what this day is about. Not a wedding. Oh, yes, it's a wedding. But it's about the transformative nature of our life in God. And the superabundance of grace and love that God gives us, that there is more of that than there is more good wine than there is sour. And that even when we experience the sour, at the end, perhaps when our bodies start to fail us and we confront the shortness of our lives, there is still more to be had. This is Jesus manifesting himself as the transformative power of our lives, taking us, simple water in jars, and turning us into the abundance of joy that can come from 21 gallons of wine. Yes. That's what Jesus does for us. Changes, transforms, raises up. That what we see in this earthly form of ours is but a shadow of what awaits us. And what awaits us is the life of Jesus. Yes, Jesus sends the Spirit into our lives to change and transform us, so that that sour wine, we realize, is not the end, but in fact is simply part of who we are. And in the transformative power of Jesus, even that is changed into utter joy as we see the risen Lord. That Lord who is among us, that Lord who is in us, that Lord who sends the Spirit among us with all the power that we need. That Lord who is with us always, now, always,